Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say this is Better Business Practices, Liability Law, and a Farrier practice. I'm Mary Bramley. I'm a full-time Farrier based out of Randolph, Mass. But prior to being a Farrier, I was actually an attorney for 10 years, and I practiced in both real estate and corporate law. And the focus of this talk today is going to cover what type of business entity you should choose for your Farrier practice, or whether you should even choose one at all. So the type of business entities that are involved in our field is being a sole proprietor. A sole proprietor is just you, that's it. There's nobody working for you, you don't have an apprentice, you're on your own. Partnerships exist in our field, LLCs, limited liability companies, and corporations. So what is going to determine your choice of business entity is going to be a couple factors that we're going to discuss today, because you don't want to set yourself up with a business entity just because somebody else did with their practice. If you have a friend that's a Farrier and they're an LLC, it may or may not be the right business entity for you to choose. So we're going to talk a little bit about the best practices of those. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of business entities? Well, to be honest, it's really going to depend on the structure of your business. If you are a sole proprietor working by yourself, it's just you and your clients. So you may not need to set yourself up as a business entity. If you are working in conjunction with a couple other Farriers, you might want to consider setting yourself up as a partnership. And if you've gotten to the point where you have a thriving practice and you've got Farriers working for you round the clock, then it might be time for you to think about setting yourself up as a corporation. So why should you set yourself up as a business entity? Well, you're going to basically think about liability, and I'll try not to bore you guys with this, but liability exists in our field, and it's going to come at you from places that you really don't expect it to. You know, it's not just the value of the horse that you could possibly be liable for. It's also business that you might be taking away from a breeding operation or a trainer or a camp. So there's more than just the regular business liabilities that come at you, you know, paying your taxes and having to pay bills to your creditors and potential lawsuits. So what is the criteria that you should think about when selecting the right business entity? Well, the first one you want to think about is your legal liability. And what I mean by legal liability is your responsibilities as a Farrier are professional responsibilities. They are that of a reasonably prudent Farrier. So given the circumstances that you're in every day and the horses that you work on, you need to say to yourself, well, what would a reasonably prudent Farrier do given this situation? So the second factor that's going to determine your business entity is tax implications. And I will just give a disclaimer right now that I'm not a tax expert. I will do my best to answer any questions you guys have on taxes. But really, you want to leave that to the professionals, whether it's going to be a CPA or a tax attorney that you should defer to. But I will talk very briefly on some of the tax benefits based on the business entity that you choose. And then the third is the actual formation and administration of the business entity that you choose. And what I mean by this is, how complicated is it to actually form the business entity when it comes to filing with the Secretary of State's office? And how much administration does the business entity involve? And what I mean by administration is the daily and the monthly and the annual responsibilities that that business entity holds. So, legal liability. Does your Farrier business lend itself to potential liability? It sure does. We're working on live animals, and they can have a huge range of value. It can be both financial and intrinsic, and you really need to take into account the seriousness of the job that you're performing. But when it comes to picking what type of business entity you're going to choose and legal liability, you need to take a look at your personal assets. And there's a couple different factors. You need to look at your marital status. If you're married and you have a spouse that relies on your income, that's pretty important. You want to make sure that that money coming in stays protected. If you have real estate's a very important personal asset that you want to have protected and shielded from liability, because the first thing that a court is going to do is they're going to attach your real estate. You wouldn't want that to be taken away from you if it's something you've worked hard for. Equipment. We all know from the trade show how valuable our equipment is. It really adds up. It's worth a lot of money. So that's definitely a personal asset to focus on. Your vehicle, they're not cheap. And some of the outfits that I've seen are pretty nice and fancy. And then you also have to take into account dependents. And what I mean by dependents are children or even adults. A lot of us are getting to the point in life where, we might have to start taking care of our parents too. And then the last factor that you take into account is savings. And that's money that's in your bank, whether it's in a savings account or it's in a retirement account. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a common example of somebody in our industry. These are completely fictitious people, but I'm sure a lot of us will be able to relate to them. So Farrier Ann has graduated from shoeing school, and she's single, so she really only has to rely on herself. She rents her apartment or her house. Her equipment is basically owned or borrowed or handed down from other farriers along the way. So, she's got a little bit of assets there. Her truck is basically financed. It's the only way that she could afford it, so there's a loan on her vehicle. And she has no dependents. So if we take these personal assets into account, if Farrier Ann was ever found liable for, a negligent act, she really doesn't have a lot of assets to lose. She doesn't have real estate that can be attached and sold by court. Some of her equipment could be forced to be sold, but how much value is going to come out of that? Her vehicle is financed, so her loan to the finance department is going to get paid off first. So they're not really going to get much money for that. She has little to no savings for them to come after. So Farrier Ann really can stay as a sole proprietor as long as she has a Farrier liability insurance policy. And I'm going to stress this no matter what business entity you choose. You have to carry insurance. It's so important. It's so cheap compared to the type of legal fees you would face just to defend yourself if somebody comes after you. The Farrier liability insurance policy is available through Markel, and then there's some others that I don't know their names that can provide it too. So if you choose to stay as a sole proprietor, you want to make sure that you have low or no value of personal assets, very few business assets. Your vehicle can have a loan on it. You pretty much don't have much for a savings or a retirement account, and you've got a current Farrier malpractice insurance policy. So given Ann's situation, I really don't feel that there are compelling reasons for her to encumber herself with filing a business entity, whether it's an LLC or an S-Corp. However, as she progresses in her business, she might want to consider, as she's starting to make a little bit more money and her truck is getting paid off, moving from a sole proprietor to an LLC. So let's talk about somebody that might be a little bit more familiar to some of you. Bob is married. So he has a spouse that relies on his income, and he also owns his real estate. So it could be mortgaged, but he's probably getting close to the point where he's, within 5 years of paying it off. He owns his equipment. He's got a nice rig. It's pretty valuable too because it's a decent setup. He owns his vehicle, whether it's a truck or a trailer, and he has a couple dependents. And his dependents could be kids or they could be parents that are living with him and they're taking care of them. He's got a savings account, and he actually does have a small retirement account that he's set up, and he also has a Farrier liability insurance policy. So if you look at Bob's assets, he has a lot more going for him than Ann does. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it in a way that he has a lot more property that can be attached in a lawsuit and taken away from him. And he also has people relying on him. He has a wife and he has dependents. And he really should seriously consider making sure that he protects himself with the right business entity. But before I get into a limited liability company, which is the entity I'm going to stress most because I think it works best in this industry, I want to cover partnerships and corporations because a limited liability company brings in the best of both partnerships and corporations. So Farrier Fred and Farrier Frank will be my partnership. And they could be married, single, divorced. It doesn't really matter. They could rent or own their real estate. They own their equipment. They have multiple vehicles, and they have auto loans on them. They have multiple kids and baby mamas to take care of. So they've got some financial savings put aside, but they have a lot of people that are relying on them too. They also have Farrier liability insurance policy. So if Farrier, Fred, and Frank choose to do nothing, the fact that they are working together on a regular basis, they have the same customers, they are already a partnership under the eyes of the law. And what I mean by that is a general partnership. So a general partnership does not have to be in writing. It is implied by law. There is no written agreement that's necessary. And the dangerous part about a general partnership is all the members of that partnership share the responsibilities of everything that that partnership involves: debts, profits, and liability. So I don't recommend general partnerships. If you're working with someone on a regular basis, it's much better that you put yourself into a limited liability partnership.
But shared debt would only be, though, only with the business, right? Anything associated or attached to the business. It would.
But the risk is you have no control over what your partner's doing. So they could basically put yourself into a situation where maybe they need to start taking more money. You don't want them to take clients away just so they can get rid of their personal debts. But yeah. Anything that they would purchase together, though, let's say they decide to go in on a trailer together. That's going to be debt that they're responsible for. You can't just walk away from it.
Would this include, pardon the term, but helpers?
That's a good question. So,
helpers that you have on a normal, like one's the Farrier, one's the helper, and they're constantly.
Yeah, it's going to come down to a couple things: how you pay them. If you pay them, I like a stipend, or you give them a certain portion of the trim or the shoes that you do. Technically, they're more of an employee to you than they are a partner. Sort of in a general contractor sense. You do want to be careful about people riding with you on a regular basis as a helper. What I would recommend is just make sure that you get them named on your Farrier insurance policy. That's the best way to cover it. But no, if they're just a helper, I wouldn't say that that's going to be found as a partnership in the eyes of the law. So the liability that can be involved in a general partnership isn't good. Let's say Fred gets really upset with an unruly horse, and he does something extremely negligent and cuts the horse's leg off to try and shoe it. This is a negligent act. Their insurance policy is not going to cover them for something like this. And because Fred lost his temper and committed negligence, Frank is responsible for this. So that's what I mean by general partnerships. You just want to make sure that you set yourself up as a limited liability partnership if you're going to go into business with somebody. So under a limited liability partnership, some of the partners are going to share debt and obligations and liability, and some are purely going to serve as investors. They don't have a ton of control over the business. And this kind of situation would work really well with a Farrier that is getting close to retirement but has a younger Farrier coming in to take over their practice. I would have them set up as a limited liability partnership in that sense, because it allows the one who's getting close to retirement to kind of sit back and not do as much of the work, but still earn income and limit themselves from the liability of the Farrier that is doing all the work. So that's probably going to be the best scenario. If you're forming a partnership, when you do, you want to make sure that you have a partnership agreement in writing when you form your limited liability partnership, and know what you're investing. What equipment is going to be brought into the partnership should be identified, the services that the partnership is going to provide, who your clientele is going to be, and then establish responsibilities and make sure that those responsibilities Clearly state what the financial obligations are. Who is going to pay for partnership debt? Who's going to be liable for those payments? And then plan an exit strategy, because partnerships can be tricky. What happens if one of you gets injured? Do you still get money, or do you not take as much from the profit sharing? And obviously partnerships sometimes end, and you want to make sure that you have buyout terms for your partnership. There is value to a partnership, and it can be spelled out in your partnership agreement. And then you always want to make sure in a partnership that you have an arbitration clause. And what I mean by arbitration is, if the two of you can't agree on someone, you agree to go to a third person. So this is going to be one example of Farrier practice that not a lot of us are going to aspire to reach, but Farrier Kate, +8. She has a thriving practice. It's booming. She has 8 full-time farriers that work for her. She's got multiple properties. She might even own a clinic where she can have truck-ins. Her equipment is extremely valuable. She has numerous vehicles that her staff uses. They have families with dependents that are relying on salaries to be paid. She has a liability insurance policy that's going to cover at least the farrier work. This is Kate +8, working hard. So she should form a corporation. And the reason why she should form a corporation is she wants to make sure that all of that lucrative money that she is making is protected. So what makes a corporation? Well, a corporation is an independent legal entity. It's an actual organization. So it's not a person like a sole proprietor is. It has much less liability than a partnership and much less liability than an LLC. And the good thing about a corporation is it continues indefinitely. So if somebody comes and goes as an employee, or if Kate even passes away, the people who are working for her are still going to be able to continue to pull salary. So they also are protected by the corporate veil, and I'll explain this in a little bit. Where do you fit in? Well, most of us are going to fit into an LLC, which is a limited liability company. The benefits of an LLC are pass-through taxation. What I mean by pass-through taxation is the money that comes into your LLC goes straight to you, every dollar, every penny. And it gets taxed on a personal level. You can do your taxes and take a standard deduction, or you can file a Schedule C and take some expenses. It's also the least complex structure to file. It's very easy to file. You file with your Secretary of State's office. It's pretty cheap. It's only about a couple $100. And it protects your personal assets. And only one member is required. So you can actually be the only person in your LLC. So LLC filing, how do you actually file your LLC? Well, first you need to come up with a name. What do you want to call yourself? You have to put the letters LLC after it. And you should contact the Secretary of State's office first to find out if that name is being used, because it cannot be a duplicate name. You also have to make sure that you assign an agent. And this is important for people like me that work in multiple states. An agent is the person who can be legally served in that state. So in the case where I live in Massachusetts, but I also work in Maine and New Hampshire and Rhode Island, I need to make sure that I have a resident of each state that I assign as an agent. And that needs to be listed when I file my LLC. You need to obtain an EIN. This is your employer identification number. You get that from the IRS, so that if you want, you can pay taxes on a corporate level through your LLC, or you can just file it personally through your own Social Security number. You may be required by your state to create an operating agreement. And an operating agreement is basically like a partnership agreement. It states what the purpose of the LLC is, the services that are going to be provided, and who is responsible for the decisions being made. So my advice is, if you're going to file an LLC, familiarize yourself with the legal obligations of your state, because it's going to vary from state to state. In Massachusetts, a one-person LLC is still required to file an operating agreement. That's not the case in other states. So everybody's thinking, okay, all I keep using is the word liable. What can I actually be held liable for? Even with your Farrier insurance policy, and me saying, trust me, I'm a Farrier, you need to make sure that you have some type of a standard that you're going to hold yourself to. So if you're going to be, one of those farriers that loses their temper and strikes a horse, there's pros and cons to having that farrier policy, and the con is going to be you're going to be held to a standard of other farriers and your peers. So think about what you're doing on a daily basis. Actions that lead to liability. So this is where a court's going to come after you. Negligence, which I just discussed, or matters not covered by your farrier liability insurance policy. And read your policies closely and make sure when it comes to negligence, if it spells out that you're responsible when you're negligent or when you're grossly negligent, because those are two very different things. You will be found liable personally, even if you establish yourself as an LLC, if you start co-signing or personally guaranteeing your LLC's debts. If you pledge property as collateral, so don't take your personal or real property as collateral for any of your LLC's debts. You can also be found liable by piercing the corporate veil. So piercing the corporate veil is when you are being sued, and basically the court is going to say you are not behaving as an entity. You're not behaving as an LLC. And what I mean by that is they're going to come after you personally. So this is how you want to make sure if you establish yourself as an LLC, you have to behave as one. So one way of not behaving like an LLC is you didn't follow the requirements of your Secretary of State's office when you formed your corporation or your LLC. So let's say I filed my LLC and I never turned in an operating agreement. You can be held personally responsible. They can go right through your LLC and the court can attach all of your personal assets. If an owner exerts too much control, you want to make sure in a multi-person LLC that you don't have one person doing absolutely everything. It should be spelled out what each individual member's responsibility is. Commingled personal funds with business funds, that's a big no-no, and the court will come after you personally. Insufficient capital at formation. This has a little bit more to do with the amount of money when you're starting up a brand new business that you put into your LLC. You commit fraud or an illegal act, or the owners treated the company as an extension of his or her personal affairs. So if you're a farrier that also has other business practices, maybe training horses, establish those boundaries very clearly when you set up your LLC. So the bottom line is, all of us really need to consider our unique needs. We need to seek expert advice, and we should always, always carry Farrier Liability Insurance Company. Here are your resources that you should go to. Your Secretary of State's office. SBAs are small business associations. A lot of regions have these, and they're very helpful when giving advice on setting up a business entity. Obviously, go to an attorney, preferably one that practices corporate law. A common question that people ask is, how much are they going to charge me? You're probably looking at anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000 up front, the very first time that you establish your LLC. After that, if you're just going back to them for advice on updating your operating agreement, it's just going to be on an hourly basis. And usually that $1,500 to $2,000 includes the filing fee, which is usually about $400 or $500. Consult a tax specialist, either a CPA or a tax attorney, to find out which of these entities is going to suit you best. And also rely on some of the people in your local and your professional farrier organizations. So, if I haven't bored you guys and put you to sleep, I will do my best to answer your questions, but I thought this was appropriate because I don't have my license anymore. I let it lapse because I don't practice law anymore. So I lead by example as long as I'm not held legally liable. So what can I do for you guys?